So I don't have very long, but let me share just a little bit, and I hope it can be helpful. And as you might have read in the abstract, I think Christianity once understood non-duality, although we never used that word. The word in mainline was unitive consciousness. But non-dual describes it very well. When I wrote my book, The Naked Now, where I was trying to introduce this word to Christians, I expected a whole lot of pushback because, Richard's become a Buddhist or a Hindu, as if that's bad, but that would have been the criticisms I would have expected. And they never came. And it's almost as if it was a liberation for a lot of Christians, at least a lot of Christians who were sincerely seeking. So I'm going to give you, and I hope it won't be boring or belabored, but a little bit of the history of how we had it, how we lost it, why we lost it, and why it's being so magnificently retrieved in our time. But it's still unknown to the vast, vast majority of Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant Christians. Especially, I have to say, the Protestant tradition, because it came along so late. It wasn't its fault, but it's no accident. We celebrate the 500th anniversary of the Lutheran Reformation, of course, this year. It was simultaneous with the invention of the printing press. And we're all historical accidents in so many ways, but of course, the printing press made us for 500 years enamored with words. And words are inherently dualistic. That isn't a put down. I'm using words right now. We need words, but they are to distinguish this from that. And once your concentration is to use words to distinguish yourself or clarify your thought, you move toward argumentativeness, endless clarification of what did that word really mean. And so we see that the older traditions, who are much more, as we just heard so beautifully, body-based, intuitive-based, based in poetry and dance and music and art, all primitive religion, which now we see maybe was not so primitive, seem to understand this, that we have to move to a different level of consciousness. Now, I'm convinced the very word prayer, which of course all of us have heard all of our lives, but originally meant a different operating system. Christians will still say, I'm going to pray about that. Now, I think what they mean is I got to get out of my argumentative, dualistic, egocentric mind and put on a mind that is bigger, broader, more accessible, as the heart math solution teaches us. But those became pretty much separated, even though what you were just beautifully talking about, the heart, that's the Desert Fathers in the 2nd and 3rd century. This was our own Christian tradition. It's amazing how much they use the word heart. And yet, in our time, heart became associated with Valentine's Day and infatuation and emotion and anything but integration. It was another kind of over-subjectivity instead of the place of integration, holding together the body and the mind and the soul and the person, as it were. So anyway, I don't think I see any evidence that Jesus ever systematically taught what we would call non-dual thinking. But he did exemplify it, right? And that's even better, when he says, I and the Father are one, his classic line of unitive consciousness with God. He says it without any apology. And of course, even then, he is called bad names for making such a daring assertion. When he says things like, my Father's sun shines on the bad and the good. His rain falls on the just and the unjust. Or when you must love your neighbor as yourself, what you do to the least of the brothers and sisters you do to me. It's unitive consciousness all over the place. And how we, in organized Christianity, got in trouble is we largely read, and I mean largely, overwhelmingly, read the words of Jesus, who was talking non-dually, mystically, if I now use those words almost interchangeably. We read him with a dualistic mind, an argumentative mind, which meant from the get-go to misunderstand what he was talking about. So we see the first great, I think, separation from the much more, you read Jesus' metaphors and examples, 90-some% of them are all nature-based. He isn't an academic teacher using concepts and ideas like, I'm afraid, I'm doing now. But he is referring to the natural world and using this to exemplify universal truths, much closer to what we later disparagingly called paganism. But the pagani, and I'm sure this is from Italian, probably, simply meant the people who lived out in the country. It wasn't a put down. It was that the cities got Christianized first, and those who lived out in the country were the pagani, or the pagans. And that for centuries became a put down. Well, he's a pagan, which usually meant he or she was a moral degenerate or something. But it actually might mean someone who's much closer to what we later called natural theology. But after the Word, we moved into anything but natural theology. It was in many ways very unnatural. So we have Jesus exemplifying it. And the first great compromise, if I can call it that, and I'm sure you've heard of this from various preachers, and although Roman Catholics, like I am, usually don't admit it, but our first great compromise was called the Constantinian Compromise. That in around 313, we moved from the catacombs to the basilicas. We moved from the lower class to the upper class. We moved to an identification with power and money and war. That's why we were called Roman Catholics, because the Roman Empire pretty much took over the show. And we needed an imperial God who could unify Europe and the Middle East. And you know what? This name, and I emphasize name, this name Jesus fit the bill, even though it had almost nothing to do with his teaching, and in many ways was absolutely contrary to his teaching. I mean, any of you familiar with the Sermon on the Mount, you can't make that by any stretch of the imagination into an imperial worldview, or an exclusionary worldview, or a mental worldview. It's entirely intuitive, love-based, nature-based, community-based, unitive consciousness, if you will. But that's when Maurizio mentioned monks were actually called friars. Doesn't make a great deal of difference, but the friars lived in the city with the people. The monks usually lived out in the country. But it all starts after that great compromise in 313, where we move into the upper class, into imperial thinking. And so huge amounts of Western Christians go off to the deserts of Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and Cappadocia, which is eastern Turkey. And there is where Christianity flourished, plus these little outlying places like Ireland and Scotland, which were not a part of the Roman Empire. That's why there's so much fascination with much more nature-based Celtic spirituality today. It wasn't Romanized. So when the Protestant Reformation comes along, and it was much needed, I'm not here to put that down at all, it brought a kind of critical thinking to a Catholicism that didn't have, at that point, much self-critical thinking. It moved us in a very different direction, you might say. But I would say after the desert period, what we would call unitive thinking, or non-dual thinking, or the balancing of knowing with not knowing, is only systematically taught in some monasteries where it maintains some form of identity. And it was usually taught in this way, and this might be a central point that'll help you understand. Forgive these two big words, but there were two main lines of spirituality inside of formal Christianity. One was called the cataphatic way, whereby you knew through words and concepts and ideas and clarity, through light, through knowing. But it was balanced in this magnificent biblical concept of faith, which evolved inside the Bible itself. It was balanced by the apophatic way, which means knowing by not knowing, or not needing to know, knowing through darkness. We got to be honest. The whole mystical tradition of knowing through darkness that we see in Dionysius in the early centuries, in the cloud of unknowing in the 14th century, for the last 500 years, once we got into the food fights of the Reformation, and that's what they were, all right? We're right and you're wrong. Our denomination is saved and your denomination is not saved. I'm going to make a strong statement, but I don't think it's much of an overstatement. That was the death of the contemplative mind. Once you need to prove that you're right and someone else is wrong, that you're the in-group and they're the out-group, what you have is the dominance of ego. And once the ego is center stage, there is no possibility of contemplation. It's all about you. It's all self-referential, and thinking declines. And let's be honest, we're seeing it in our present politics. Just could we have imagined that human, civil, public conversation could go this low? But that's all you have left when you have dualistic thinking paramount. In fact, it's the only game in town. As a Franciscan, as a priest, it tells me religion has not been doing its work. We are not transforming this culture. And the Judeo-Christian tradition is still supposed to be the foundational religion of Western civilization, whether it really is or whether it ever was, I don't know. I'm not here to make that point. But, a civilization cannot survive if it is actively involved in hatred toward its own spirituality. And that's pretty much where we're at now, but for understandable reasons. That it just wasn't doing the job. It was more what spiral dynamics would call tribal thinking, blue level consciousness, where it wasn't about being a transformed person, it was about belonging to a tribe. And we were the Catholic tribe, some of you were the Protestant tribe, some of you were the Jewish tribe. And that became the be-all and the end-all, affirming the boundaries of your tribe, why it was right, which left us at a pretty low level of knowing. So, again, I want to repeat, I didn't develop it enough a moment ago, but when you have balanced knowing with not knowing and not needing to know, the ordinary arrogance of the mind, which, by the way, I think Genesis warns us against. There's a most unlikely line in the creation story of the Jewish people where Yahweh tells them, if you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will most surely die. Now, that's a really shocking statement. I had 4 years of moral theology. I got a degree in eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Do you understand? And I think it was a warning to tell a religion, you better be humble about your knowledge of who's right and who's wrong, who's in and who's out. Warning right in the first chapters of the Bible against eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, we've been eating of it for centuries, voraciously. And when you only have the cataphatic way, certitude, clarity, concepts and opinions about which I can be right and you can be wrong, you have the death of darkness, non-knowing. I have to say the only place where that was consistently taught was in the mystics. The mystics, they revel, people like John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, they revel in the language of darkness. They called it learned ignorance. Learned ignorance. Isn't that interesting? The freedom not to have to know, in fact, gives space around your knowing that allows you to move to the heart, to the intuitive. But this arrogance around knowing pretty much has controlled the field. I'm sure you've heard that line that if you want to tell a lie and get away with it, tell a really big lie. We've had some evidence of that in the last year, And ironically, people are more ready to believe really big lies than little ones. I don't know the logic of that. But that was certainly true in the whole degeneration of the biblical notion of faith. when faith meant comfortably not knowing. And we turned that around 180 degrees into being certain about everything, which has reached its low point in what we call fundamentalism, which is not just true in Christianity, but really it's resurged in all of the major world religions. In this confused and confusing world, the need for certitude, so I know that I'm on solid ground and I'm purposeful and smart, that's where we're at. And I think why so much organized religion in general, Christianity in particular, has just lost the respect of a lot of, and when I use the word thinking people, I'm not meaning they got to be highly intelligent or academic, but just people who are using what I'd call Christian common sense. But we weren't trained in Christian common sense, We were trained in ideology which overrode the heart, the intuitive, the communal, the unitive. So we pretty much, I was able to talk to Google yesterday, and I was absolutely amazed. Jesus has a line, I think it's in Luke's gospel, where he says, the children of this world are wiser in their ways than are the children of light. Talk about a critique of religion, Those who think they have the light, he said, sometimes those who don't make any claims. I'm sure many of you know more about Google than I do, but it was just like, yesterday was like walking in a different universe. How could all the rules of business be so different and have so many happy people and so many self-initiating staff and creative and excited staff riding their bicycles around the campus? This is a different model for knowing. And I don't see any large religious symbols on the campus. But I'll tell you, my recent book is on the Trinity, where I want to mention that for a reason. See, the law of three was made to order to undo the law of two. Two is always oppositional. Two is always antagonistic. Whenever your mind makes a distinction between Republican, Democrat, black, white, gay, straight, American, non-American, we can show that within a nanosecond, you choose sides. It's just the dang nature of the mind. And it thinks it's smart because it chose one side. This is where we're at right now. And it's just not getting us anywhere. So I forgot where I was going with that point. What was I about to say? Doesn't matter. If Trinity, yes, okay. God. The foundational Christian doctrine about the nature and shape of God, and we just made it into a mathematical conundrum which we couldn't resolve, so we shelved the whole thing. And I remember the Irish nuns who taught me, and she held up the shamrock in the third grade and says, God is like this. And then she said, don't think about it, all right? Now, actually, this Irish nun was rather correct, really, because it is unthinkable, just like we learn about consciousness and the nature of the universe. But the first word, and this, if you haven't maybe been exposed to formal Christian theology, it might strike you as heretical or unusual. But it took that early Christian period 3 centuries to unpackage this gobbledygook language of Jesus, where he's talking about being one with the Father, but talking to the Father as if the Father's over there, giving you the Spirit, but being one with the Spirit. The Spirit is in the Father gives you the Spirit. When I read, John's Gospel as a priest, I can just see all Catholics, their eyes just glaze over. I don't know what he is talking about. Well, the whole Christian world didn't know what he was talking about. But after 3 centuries in Cappadocia, 3 brilliant theologians, 2 named Gregory, 1 named Basil, they finally said, well, here's the best we can do. God is like a circle dance. Peri means around. Choresis or choreography means dance. If I said that to you today without quoting the 3rd century or 4th century, you'd think I was really flaky, wouldn't you? Huh? God is a circle dance. Well, the reason we can talk that way and receive at least a partial receptivity is because of quantum physics and everything you've been talking about here. Suddenly, God as a flow, God as a communion, God as an intercommunion, God as an interdependence, not a particle, but the relationship between the particles. My God, Christians had this in code form all along and never recognized it. I'm predicting in my book, The Divine Dance, that the next century will be the rediscovery of the real shape of God. And the irony is, I know if you weren't raised Christian, or even if you were, to talk about Trinity must sound like super, super, super Christian stuff. Actually, it isn't, because most Christians don't understand it. And in fact, it opens up the entire world of interfaith dialogue, because we have the Father as the unknowable one, total mystery. We have the Spirit as the indwelling one, incarnate along with Jesus into the physical universe. We have God flowing everywhere between knowability and unknowability, between psyche and physicality. It suddenly is actually a rather talkable notion of God. Whereas when I grew up, I mean, you listen to our TV. How often have you heard the phrase on American TV, the man upstairs? It's just a throw, the man upstairs, the man upstairs. And we're supposed to accept that. And most Christians don't even critique it. It's absurd. At first he's male, and he's almost always a white male. Usually has a nice white beard too, you know.
He's got to deal with the woman downstairs.
It's unworkable. It's unworkable, you know. And then, you know, I was the last generation of priests that had to learn Latin, and you probably know the Latin word for God is Deus, D-E-U-S. Does that sound anything like Z-E-U-S? Of course it does. It's the same concept. It's the same word. We basically, again, along with the whole Greco-Roman Empire, and it gave us many wonderful things, but our concept of God never moved much beyond Zeus. And Zeus was throwing down thunderbolts at people he didn't like. You know, we just differentiated who the ones were we didn't like. Pagans and witches and women and heretics and sinners, and every culture and every century decided on a different sinner. You know, if you look at always who were the sinners was different, but we had to scapegoat somebody because that keeps a group together. And when you're at the tribal level, that's what you want to do. You want to know you're right. You want to hold your knowing in a safe enclave so you don't expose it to any non-knowing, whereas the majority of the mystery of the Trinity is unknowable. But we thought we knew God, so we sort of pushed Jesus into the place of the Trinity. You know, I'm not a heretic in saying this, although to some of you it'll sound like it. As Christians do, to formally say Jesus is God is bad theology, is incorrect. The Trinity in Christian theology is God, all right? And when you pull Jesus out of this and put him up on a big throne that looks like Zeus, you no longer have a dynamic universe. Really. You no longer have a God who is in the flow of everything, but a being instead of being itself. Now, my early Franciscan tradition, a name you probably never heard of, a man named John Duns Scotus from Scotland, taught at Oxford. He taught of the univocity of being. You may speak with one voice, univocity. You may speak with one voice of the being of the earth, of the waters upon the earth, the plants that grow from the earth, the animals that live on the earth, the humans that live on the earth, and the angels and God. The entire chain of being could be spoke of with one consistent voice as being. Now, if you Protestants think that's heresy, go to Acts 17. What does Paul say to the smart people on the Areopagus in Athens? he says, God is the one in whom you live and move and have your very being. So we thought of God as a being, usually an old man upstairs sitting on a throne, throwing down thunderbolts, which created a very unsafe universe, by the way. Really, very unsafe. If God isn't on your side foundationally, if God isn't the ultimate participant. So what Trinitarian doctrine does is move us from a God as a critical spectator, big C, big S, critical spectator, to a God who is ultimate participant, big U, big P, ultimate participant. There's nothing to fight about anymore. There's nothing to prove. There's nothing you need to prove. You just need to get into the dance, you know. I was glad you also used the word flow, Deborah. That's probably the word I use in the divine dance more than anything. And usually in the first, you do this all without any degree in theology. You're around someone 5 minutes, and you can tell whether they're in the flow or whether they're resisting it and blocking it, and holding you at arm's length and holding themselves inside. You all know that. And you don't have to have any orthodoxy tests to see people who are inside what I'd call the Trinitarian flow and people who are not. So, to try to sum this up, I hope I haven't been all over the place, but we have a God who is unknowable, and yet Christians would believe because human beings need a face, a form, a love, a smile that they can touch, as the first letter of John says, that they can look upon. Christians believe that this formless one, this unknowable one, became in Jesus knowable and lovable. You don't have to accept that, but you got to know that's what Christian belief is. That we needed a moment of knowability to balance out the supreme unknowability of the Father and the Holy Spirit, who are like the space between the particles in the atom. You know, you can't capture them, you can't measure them, you can't control them. You know, I live in New Mexico, and of course, as you know, that's where the bomb was put together, and on July 16, 1945, it was dropped south of Albuquerque, where I live. When Robert Oppenheimer observed the great explosion, he said this site should be called Trinity Site. And only years later did he himself wonder why he did that. He said, I just knew the place where we had undone the three atomic particles was somehow connected to this mystery of Trinity. That if this is the basic building block of everything, the law of three, which is always dynamic, I'm not trying to make you into a Christian, I'm trying to help you respect dynamism as opposed to oppositionalism, And that was the real point. And he said when we undo that, when we undo the Trinity, the dynamic flow of creation, the universal ecosystem that everything is, circulatory system, gravitational pulls, and sexuality. Everything is attracted to everything, as so many of our mystics said. Everything loves everything and moves toward union with it. When we stop thinking that way, I'm afraid Western Christianity largely became a PhD in dualistic thinking. And that's what you've grown up with, I'm afraid. And if some of you with great sincerity or great intelligence actually found yourself reacting against it or moving beyond it, I have to say, I can understand that. I was just lucky enough that the Franciscans gave me a nature-based, thanks to Francis himself, spirituality. A man who could speak of brother sun, sister moon, sister water, brother fox. It was not a subject-object world for Francis, as it should have been for any mystic. It was meeting reality subject to subject, center to center, where you grant mutuality, you grant subjectivity, you grant respect and reverence, and you let the animals talk back to you. Now, if I'd say that to most mainline Catholics, I'm sorry to say, I wouldn't be invited back, you know. And yet they all have their sentimental little pictures of St. Francis talking to the birds and preaching to the fish and everything, which he did. You see, once you're inside the enchanted universe where everything is granted subjectivity, let me tell you something I just told the people at Google yesterday, and this might be the biggest payoff of all. You're never lonely again. I deal as a counselor with so much bad effect of human loneliness, human cut-offness, and in many ways it seems to be increasing on this earth. Huh? When you can grant mutuality, conversation, dialogue, dignity, use any of those words, to a leaf, to a lizard, to the sky, and see this is the divine dance. Now, if you're Jewish, how many of the Psalms don't say that? The mountains clap their hands, the rivers leap for joy, that this whole natural universe is the first Bible. And that's what the early Franciscans taught. And they said if we murdered and mangled and manipulated and destroyed, which we've largely done, the first Bible, how would we possibly have the skills to reverence and use correctly the written Bible? And of course, the first Bible seems to have been written about 14 billion years before the second one. So I always say, did God have nothing to do for 14 billion years? God had nothing to say. The message was just waiting for Roman Catholics to appear, you know? Come on. We're not operating out of a scarcity model. And unfortunately, my Protestant brothers and sisters, you didn't reform us in that at all. In fact, it became more individualistic, more righteousness, talking about moral behavior will make this God who is Zeus like you. It was an unworkable proposition. So I suppose you're hearing me and saying, is he Christian? Or I'm actually very traditional Christian and very critical of Christianity at the same time. I hope your non-dual mind will allow you to hold those two together. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.